Well, good morning, everyone. We have quite a turnout today. We're over 90 people so far, and the number just keeps growing. It's just so exciting for us to join you again on a Saturday morning to talk about child protection, and hopefully this set of materials is even more helpful than the last set. So this is the second webinar in our series working with IRCOS around child protection resources for schools. Now, if you joined our first webinar, we were talking about an overview for child protection in a school. And what we did is we just basically talked about all the touch points of child protection in your school as you look at doing planning or doing evaluation or doing resourcing or staffing. What we're going to do today is actually look a little bit deeper into something that you can apply directly with your school. Probably on Monday, you can start working on this. The central document that we all have at our schools is this child protection policy. And what we're going to do today is kind of take those concepts that we talked about last time around the overview for child protection in a school and put them into a living document that is tailored specifically for your school. Now, just a little clarification on some of the earlier emails. If this was listed as a two-part session, this is going to be a one-part session. We're going to do 90 minutes today, and we're going to delve deep into how to craft your child protection policy. We're going to look at an example, and as before, we're going to be very happy to answer any questions. But with this today, you are actually going to get a template that you can use back in your schools. You're going to get some examples. As I said, I'm recording this, and as we talked about before, this is part of a series of webinars that I'll discuss in a minute. And everybody who attends today will get a certificate of attendance that you can put on your wall, show your family, broadcast live that you got up on a Saturday to talk about child protection, which is pretty impressive in my estimation. So thank you, everybody. We really, really appreciate it, except for my Canadian friend who's not up on a Saturday. It's still Friday for that person. So thank you for joining us. Okay, let's jump right in. So here are we. These are the presenters. So my name is Dr. Matt Harris, and I am the co-founder and CEO of ChildSafeguarding.com. I'll talk a little bit more about ChildSafeguarding.com towards the end, and everybody who joins today, if you want to try ChildSafeguarding.com, we'll be happy to give you a complimentary seat. I'm joined today with Chris Gould, who's an independent child protection expert with 112 Safeguarding. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Matt, and hello to everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to echo Matt's thanks for turning out on a Saturday/Friday evening for the one from Canada, but it's great to have you all here. So briefly, just a little bit about my background. I served in the British Police Force for just over 30 years, working mostly as a detective. And I was head of the Child Protection Group for a number of years and was also involved in the investigation of major crime. I finished my service as a detective chief superintendent and whilst serving, managed to get some funding from the Home Office and European Commission to actually undertake some research in various parts of the world, looking at children and young people who had been abused specifically whilst engaged on educational, cultural, or language trips abroad. As a result of that work, I was able to found an international children's charity based in the UK. And when I retired or finished with the police, I became the CEO of that charity for a few years, and then migrated to Australia in 2013, becoming the honorary vice president of that organization. But in 2014, I set up my own safeguarding consultancy in Australia, and in May of that year was brought in to support the Jakarta Intercultural School with a significant abuse crisis that they were under the throes of at that time, and separately worked with the FBI on the William Vahi case in Indonesia at the same point of time. And since then, all of my work has been involved with international schools of one sort or the other. That's me.
Wonderful. And Chris's background in working with international schools is specifically around anything related to child protection, whether it's training or auditing or help with legal advice. One of the things that he does quite frequently is do work around policy development. And so Chris and I met in Jakarta. I was actually at a different school, and he came and did his whole program with us and trained me. And it was in that discussion that we started talking about the ins and outs of child protection and safeguarding. And as we've grown, kind of the working relationship that we've had together, we've worked together to build childsafeguarding.com. And we decided kind of early on that we wanted to produce a series of resources that would help schools have a better understanding of child safeguarding and child protection, and to have things that were actually practical that they could use in their schools. And so the webinar today is one of those resources that we're making freely available to schools to help them create a well-crafted child protection policy that will meet the needs of the school and kind of cover all the bases as related to that overview that we talked about last time. Okay. Now, this is our second webinar of 4. So we're doing 4 webinars around these resources that I just mentioned, and we're really, really pleased to be doing this with IRCOS. As you all know, IRCOS is just an amazing organization, and to have them invite us to join and talk to you about these things it's been a real pleasure for us. They're great to work with, and to have so many people engaged is just really exciting for us. As I said, today we're going to talk about child protection policy, and we'll actually link it to some other ones. The next one we're going to talk about in November is training. So making sure that everyone in the school is appropriately trained. And then finally, we will discuss the role of the designated safeguarding lead, the DSL, excuse me, the DSL in your school in December. Now, these are all open to IRCOS members, so I will give you links towards the end. And in addition to sharing the recording for this webinar, I'll also share the slides and the materials. And in the slides, they'll have the link. So please make sure to sign up for the other ones. I've already noticed that we've got 50 or 60 signups for the November one, which is really exciting. So thank you for that. And again, thank you for IRCOS. This has been a great experience for us. Okay, so this is what we're going to do today. We're going to revert back first to that definition of child protection to make sure that all of us are on the same page, to know what we're talking about. We're then going to talk about the context and best practices for creating your child protection policy. Excuse me. And then we're going to review a template. So you're actually going to get a template today. We have a version that you'll be able to download today. And go through it with me. So we're not going to have as many PowerPoint slides because we're actually going to go through a live document. Then we'll review an example and talk about some of the highlights and some of the things we might do a little bit differently if given the chance. And then we'll talk about putting it all together and actually doing this with your school. So you're not going to come out today with a fully fledged child protection policy, but you'll have all the tools that you need to be able to create one back at your school. And Sarah's done something really good for us. We are looking for everyone to participate. And Sarah has actually already asked a question about DSL training. Happy to answer that later. Sarah, if you could remind us a little bit towards the end. We're going to do a lot of questions along the way. And Chris and I are always available at the end to answer questions. So can you hold on to that one because it's a little bit off topic from what we're doing today. But you have demonstrated my request, and that is that everybody participate. You know, there's going to be a lot of detail and a lot of content here. Everybody's school is different. And as we had last time, we really want to make sure to meet your needs more than the needs that Chris and I have to say what we want to say. So what I ask for you to do is please engage. So use the chat, put questions in there. I'm monitoring it. Please also use the Q&A function if you feel that's more helpful to you. Whichever one works. I will try and answer these questions, and Chris will answer these questions live in the webinar. So we want to make sure that your needs are met and your thoughts and questions and opinions are shared, because there's just more value for everybody if it's more of an engaging conversation. So please do use those things. We know the chat works because everybody's been sharing where they are in the world. And so please have that open and join the conversation. Okay, how do we define child protection? If you were with us last time, you know that we have a definition here. But the reason that we jump into this first is because there's a little bit of inconsistency in the definition of child protection for schools in the schools that Chris and I work with. Schools have a different approach, and it's not that this is wrong. It's just a reality of the field related to safeguarding and child protection. However, there should be some unifying concepts that are really important to have across the board for all these schools. And that's why we like to focus this. The other reason that we like to focus on this is probably the central discussion point when you're creating your child protection policy, is to define for your own school in your own context what you mean by child protection. What is that shared definition that everybody can use in order to have a common understanding around what you're doing with this policy and with your child protection program? So this is the definition that we offer. Child protection is the commitments and actions taken to protect children from abuse. Okay, so it's a commitment and the following actions as well. So you actually have to do something, right? And what we're going to do in our policy today is we're going to outline what those commitments are and what those definitions are and give a framework for action. We're not going to define every action because we don't want the policy to get too big. But within this policy, we are going to further define child protection related to your school. We're going to talk about your commitments and your approaches and cultures around this. And then we're going to talk about those actions and requirements of people that are on the campus to protect children. Okay. Child protection involves all aspects of the school community, and everyone has a role to play. And this is an important point that we like to touch on every time. And that is to make it clear that child protection touches everything, right? There's not a part of your school that doesn't have some impact, in child protection, right? Child protection is hitting everything. And because students are interacting with so many people, even the support staff that have, temporary access to students, or parent volunteers that are only doing a little bit, also have a role to play. Every single adult has a role to play. And as you're going to find, as we talk about this more, even the students themselves have a role to play. Okay, we have a question. So Aaron asked, our school has a boarding school. Should a separate child protection, I assume, policy be prepared for boarding purposes, or do we integrate a chapter in the common document shared by old members? Chris, what do you think about that? For boarding schools, is that considered a separate entity that needs a separate policy, or are they part of the same organization where they should have the same policy?
I think it's, if they're part of the same organization, then they should stick to the same policy fundamentally. But there may be some slight nuances with a particular boarding facility, which may require a separate annex to that policy. But largely and fundamentally, the principle should be that if it's the same organization, then you stick by the same child protection policy.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've defined child protection. Now let's talk about this policy. Why is it so important? What is the big deal about having a child protection policy? Well, it is the central governing document for child protection at your school. So that one central resource that everybody can go to. It is the universally accessible child protection resource for anybody in and outside the school. So if anybody is outside of the organization or even inside the organization, before talking to anybody, they need to have a central resource that's universally accessible. This is what your child protection policy does, is it creates that resource. And because it is accessible for anyone, that means that the audience needs to be for anyone. It is the shared reference that influences child protection culture. And one of the things we talked about last time was the difference between strategic child protection and operational child protection. This one influences that child protection strategy and that culture that comes out from the leadership, because it's put on paper what those commitments are. So this is very important. You should be able to live your child protection policy, and everybody else should be able to have access to it. It's a baseline for practice. So beyond the strategic part, it also is it's an operational guide. Now, it's not going to map out everything, and you'll see that when we get into the individual document, but it does give you a baseline. So it will map out some of the major duties that you need to have accounted for within your child protection program, such as reporting and recording, actions taken in various circumstances, and monitoring duties. It has it is your connection to international standards and expectations, whether local or global. And this is where we talk about legal requirements and accreditation needs and expectations within the community to create a safe environment. So this is where you're making that connection in something that's written and publicly accessible. And so that's why it's so valuable, because everybody's going to see that connection, that central kind of linchpin between the operational and the strategic, between the spoken and the written, between the standards and the practices. And it contains your definitions. So like I said, you need to define child protection for yourself in your school. This is done and recorded within this document, so everybody knows what those definitions are. They have an idea about what practices are taken at the school and what the requirements are for being at the school. All of those should live within this policy because it's a central living document for your school. Okay. So what does it need to have? Right. And this was something that Chris and I used as we were defining out kind of the details of the child protection policy template. Well, it needs a few things. It does need to be universally accessible. So one of the things we do at childsafeguarding.com is that we have what we call a recognized school program. So schools that have trained sufficient numbers of people can join this recognition program and kind of broadcast to the world that child protection is very important to us and we train everybody on campus. But one of the requirements that we have is that your child protection policy is publicly available on your website. This is not something that people should have to go find or should be hidden in a policy manual. This is something that should be broadcast for clarity, for understanding, but then also to make a very clear statement to everybody, whether they're potential employees or students or existing people within the community, that child protection is important. And this is something that the school has a full commitment to, and here are our commitments. It does need to involve all stakeholder groups. So this is an important piece that Chris and I have talked about in depth, that in the construction, as you're going to see here, we're going to give you a template that gives you a very nice roadmap to create this child protection policy. It's not something that should be done with just the leadership team during an SLT meeting or something. This is something that needs to get input from teachers, from students, from parents, from community members. You need to figure out how you're going to do that to get their voice within the document, but this is not a leadership document. This is a community document. It does need to be understood and put into action. So the action piece is connecting to other policies and procedures and things that you do within the campus, but the understood part is also very important. You need to write this not as a standard policy that we have at our schools that can be very onerous and very difficult to read. This needs to be something that can be consumed by people in the community. And we actually have a recommendation a little bit later that you make a version just for students. Okay. And it doesn't need to be a living document. Child protection changes, the needs of the school change, the context changes. So this is something that you need to revise on a regular basis. Okay. So those are some of the needs that we've put into practice, or that we've kind of embedded into the template that we're going to share with you in just a second. Now, the child protection policy is not a standalone document. It is connected to an ecosystem of policies within your school. And those of us who have worked in schools realize that there are probably more policies at our school than students. But there are some important ones that we need to put the child protection policy into action. Think about the child protection policy as a table of contents and perhaps even an index and an introductory chapter to a book at your school. It's going to define the important things. It's going to set the tone. It's going to give you a roadmap of what child protection is at your school, but it's not going to go into the details of how do we monitor the CCTV on campus? How do we deal with data protection? Those things need to live in other policies. We do not want to bloat or grow the child protection policy to be too big, because it's not readable at that point. It's not usable and it's not a living document. Now, we're going to give you an opportunity to cross-reference and do all of these things, but it is very important that the child protection policy that you create is part of a larger ecosystem. Now, Chris, we've listed a few policies here, but how do you look for the policies that need to be connected to this child protection policy?
Well, I mean, there are so many potential safeguarding related policies. This is just a handful that we've selected here to sort of demonstrate some of the key ones. So if you're at the beginning steps or stages of actually developing safeguarding related policies in your organization, then these may be helpful to begin with. But beyond that, there are plenty of others, and there's further information that we can give out if people need a sort of checklist to compare what they may need. I mean, the other thing, of course, is that you don't necessarily, depending on where you are, depending on what your strengths and weaknesses of your organization, and actually culturally where you are, some of these policies may not be relevant. So it is a checklist. It is about seeing what is useful in the area that you're actually operating before identifying what those are. But certainly these then fit under the main child safeguarding or child protection policy itself.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful. So again, remember that your child protection policy is just kind of the center point for a series of policies that deal with various aspects of child protection. Now, a few things that we mentioned last time, but they also apply here. And that is that your child protection program, your child protection practices at your school are influenced by a number of things, as is your policy. You are going to be governed by common practice, standards, and laws for your local country. So that's important for you to recognize that. There is going to be school culture that is going to affect this quite a bit, all the way down to your definition of child protection. The definition of child protection that I've provided you is one that we find to be very generic, but yours may be different. So that's something that you need to focus on within your school to ensure that you have child protection, that a child protection definition that works for all of you. The strategy and operations will differ from school to school. So your policy will be unique. And remember that, because Chris and I have a very clear statement that's going to come up in just a second, and that's this one. Do it yourself. Don't cut and paste. So we've seen a number of child protection policies at schools where they have taken verbiage and they've taken pieces from other publicly available policies, but it's really not a good practice because you're not making that child protection policy authentic to your school. And what you find is, though one or two people have put a lot of time into finding these materials and saying, oh yeah, that fits for us, because they haven't crafted it themselves, it doesn't have any life within the school, and people forget about that content after it's published. So it really is incumbent on you to make sure that you do not cut and paste. And what I'd recommend is that as you do not cut and paste, make sure that you're accounting for all of these items. So your school is serving a particular context that is specific to your school, right? We have legal requirements, be it in Indonesia or Thailand or Canada or Singapore, that are going to be different from country to country. You're serving a population of teachers, of community members, even a local population that is going to be quite diverse, that are going to need some specific accounting. There are going to be different cultures within your organization, whether they're local cultures or, the 50 nationalities. And also the purpose of your school may be different than others. Maybe you're an inclusive school. Maybe you're a finishing school. There's any number of reasons or a number of ways that your mission could be different from others. And these are things that we recommend that you always have in the back of your mind as you're crafting out that child protection policy. Okay, so I think we've given you enough of an introduction. We've given you our big statement here about don't cut and paste. So let's talk about a template. Now I'm going to leave this on the screen for just a moment. And then hopefully I can put it into the chat in just a moment. But CSAware / child protection CP policy Microsoft. So this will give you a Word version of the template. Or there is a Google version that will ask you to copy onto your into your own Google Drive that allow you to use this as well. So I'll leave this up here for just a couple of seconds. Please download a copy, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the PowerPoint here just a second. Thank you very much, Aaron. That's very helpful. Aaron, can you put up the Google one as well, just to help us out? That would be great. So there's a link in the chat for both of them. Thank you, Aaron. That is very helpful. So the links are in the chat if you want to download these yourself, because what we're going to do next is we're just going to go through the document, and we're going to go through it piece by piece to talk about how these things apply to you and how to use the document. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing, and then I'm going to bring up my Word document here, and we'll make it a little bit more visible. Okay, hold on one second. See if I can get rid of some. There you go. That's nicer. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the document itself. You have a copy of this, so you can follow along if you want, or you can watch me on my version. But what we're going to do basically is we're going to go through this document piece by piece to just to go through how to use it, what are the pieces, and how we would recommend that you CP Paul CS Aware. Yes, thank you, Aaron. So use the second link for our Google. Thank you very much. Okay, so what we've created for you is a school child protection policy template, and this is something you can use. Both Chris and I created it as part of our commitment to providing child protection resources to schools, and it's for you to use. It is built out. I'm doing the Word one, obviously. It is built out so that you can ostensibly fill in the form, fill it out for your particular school. And we've given you recommendations, we've given you suggestions, and we've actually formatted the document where you just have to put the data in, erase a couple pages, and then update the table of contents, and then you're ready to go. So let's go through it page by page. And please ask any questions you have along the way, because there's a lot of detail in here, and there may be some nuances that you want to know a little bit more about. Okay, a few things that I want you to notice on here, that this particular page right here is an introductory page that we've just put on. We suggest you get rid of it. You don't need this on your final version, because you're really going to use this specific document itself for your, excuse me, for your child protection policy. So our recommendation is you get rid of page 1 and page 2. But within page 2, we have a big introduction to tell you how to use the policy. And I'm going to go through it right now, but you'll have this on your document later on. Okay, so this template is produced as a guide to develop and author your own child protection policy. And it probably is a little bit more than that, because it gives you a structure that you can follow to cover all of the main areas you need to cover in a child protection policy to give you that detailed overview of child protection in your school. It is a guiding document that will help influence your culture and your commitments. And so those are things that we recommend, and I'm right here. Those are things that we recommend that you include within all of your discussions and all your thoughts about the verbiage and about how you're going to answer questions and how you're going to structure this. Is what are our commitments? What is our culture around child protection? And how does that guide our practices? The audience for this policy is all members of the school community. As I said, we recommend you make this publicly available. It should be written with all adults in mind, not just the academic, operational, or leadership members of your staff. So we do recommend you write it for anybody, anybody coming in to learn more about the school. Think about it from the standpoint of protection. If a potential abuser was doing some research whether they wanted to apply for a job at your school and they read this document, would they understand your commitment to child protection and say, you know what, I'm not going to go there because they clearly are going to protect every child that I'm going to target? That's another item just to keep in the back of your mind. We do suggest making a child-friendly version of this for students because students do need to be involved in child protection because they need to protect themselves. Okay, so what we suggest here, the document itself should be developed with stakeholder input, not solely by a select group. It's the best practice to include student input as well. So we do recommend that everybody be involved with this. The text should be originally written by members of your school community. Do not copy text from other schools' policies. It should be reviewed and revised regularly. Now, one of the questions, Chris, that I know you typically get is, you're saying involve all the stakeholder groups. How do you do that? Are you doing some gigantic meeting? Are you doing sub meetings? Like, what do you find is the best approach to make sure that all of these stakeholder groups are involved?
Well, this will vary from school to school, but in many schools now we're seeing the development of a child protection team or a child protection committee or even a task force or similar. And that group, if developed well enough, can be sufficiently varied in the content with mixed members of staff from different parts of the organization, and even include parent representatives or the like. It won't necessarily include students at this stage, but certainly should have a good variation and a cross section from the organisation. So this is the place to actually start any framework for a policy when you're looking at something of this nature. Then, depending on the policy, and this would be a good one to work with and extend further, this would be the sort of policy that you'd take out to maybe a couple of other working groups and actually get their feedback. But that would depend on the organisation. It will depend on capacity. It will depend on how big the organisation is and what the commitment of that Child Protection Committee or team is. But certainly to get the benefit of this, this is what you're striving to achieve.
Now, one of the questions we always get is how big should these committees be, right? Because we always run into the camel problem. And I'm sure you've heard the camel problem where you ask, what is a camel? A camel is a horse designed by a committee. So how big should the committee be? And I know that's it changes from school to school, but are there some specific characteristics in looking at this task force or committee?
No, I think, being a politician here, the answer is, you know, you fit it to the size of your organization. But here's the thing, my view is that you go larger than you think. And that's because my experience is that many of these people are not always available on the days of the meeting, and it's good to have you know, other representatives there so that you don't have a group that starts out at of 10 or 12 and suddenly ends up on the day at 3. You know, you want to make sure that you've got capacity there, because this is the engine room of everything that goes on within the strategic and the operational part of the school, in a sense of safeguarding. So that's what this committee is about, and should be driving, not just the development of this particular policy that we're talking about now, but it will have tasks relevant to a whole range of safeguarding specific actions.
And you need a diversity, don't you? You need not only the stakeholder groups, but you need people that have knowledge around academics and operations and local government relations, and maybe even a safeguarding trained person, right? I mean, there's a certain profile of people that you need to cover within these groups, correct?
Absolutely. And ideally, what you're trying to achieve here is to make sure that this group of what I would call key safeguarding stakeholders should actually be trained as far as you can to the maximum level. So this would be up to level 3, which would be you know, a specialist level. Which is how far we would take training in relation to a specific DSL, designated safeguarding lead, for example. But it's really important that, you know, when you're tasking a group to look at strategic issues around safeguarding, or even operational detail around policy or beyond, that those individuals must have a sense and an understanding of how child safeguarding operates. And what the legal frameworks are, and how that works with definitions and so on and so forth. So it's important that they are adequately trained. And of course, this is your group, this is the platform for recruiting future child protection officers or designated safeguarding leads. I mean, some of them, if not all of them, will be part of that group anyway. But depending on numbers, you may need more in that group.
Gotcha. So we have a question and we have a comment here that I want to address here. So Lori said that for updates and policies, we usually do a series of focus group discussions, and each group consists of different stakeholders, faculty, staff, parents, and students. And I think what I would say to that is, I think that's a great idea, but that's not going to be the first thing you do in the construction of your child protection policy, even in the first revision of your child protection policy, because the group needs to get together to have a basic framework of what needs to be accomplished and what are the areas of focus are, and even answering some of those questions in advance before they bring in other people to give input. So the input is critical, but there needs to be almost a base to that infrastructure foundation, as it were, in order to go out to those people. So I think that's great. We just need to make sure that everybody kind of knows what we're going to be talking about, and those focus group discussions, for lack of a better term, are focused on specific topics. And then somebody asked this question, Chris, and this is probably more for you. Do we need a policy for parents? If yes, is it necessary for them to acknowledge by signing the policy every school year?
I don't think you need to create a specific policy for parents. I think what is important is that parents actually have access to and see and hopefully read, but more importantly, understand what the school policy is around safeguarding and child protection. Now that will be difficult in some instances because some parents won't be that interested in it. But there's the challenge, and the challenge is to create different systems, different methods, different techniques for providing information to parents and guardians, so that there is a constant trickle of safeguarding information being fed into the home and into the laps, effectively, of parents, so that they digest it without necessarily seeing that it is part of a package. But at the same time, for those parents that are committed to this and are interested in it, yes, we need to provide something more substantial, and that might be, having regular evenings where you run sessions on not just safeguarding, but other things, but bring parents in to talk to them in a bit more detail about it. But in terms of the policy, there should not be a real need to have a dedicated parents child protection policy. If they want to learn more beyond what the policy talks about in terms of parenting, then that's a different matter. And there's something that you can actually take up as something useful to attract parents in to the organization, to actually signpost them towards the specialism itself, or to actually give that type of input to help parents in a broader sense. So yeah, stick to the school policy, but try and think of some unique ways of actually getting parents to engage with it.
Isn't it counter to the spirit of what we're talking about here, this being a community policy, if you have a separate specific policy for one stakeholder group?
Potentially. I mean, the risk here is that you start breaking it down into segments, and what we're trying to create is a organizational culture first, but there may be a need to break down in particular areas, and we've already discussed one of them earlier, which was the boarding school issue. So there may be some specific nuances within the organization, like the boarding element, that may need its own particular policy or part policy. And other areas might include things like field trips, where it needs to be something a little bit more specific and nuanced around how you organize homestays or the like.
But those are for operational elements. Those are not for specific people. Anyway, let's move on. Rosa, you've asked a question that I'm sorry, I don't understand. I don't know what that means. Can you try and rephrase your question? And then Christopher, thank you for your question. I'm going to hold off for a bit while we get further into the policy, and we'll come back to that one a little bit later. So I'm just going to leave that one up for now. Okay, so as we've said, this needs to be a shared document that is available online and built by the community. Now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go into some technical elements. And you showed up for child protection training, and you're going to get some technology training, and you're going to learn a little bit about copyrights. So hey, there you go, free learning for everybody. So what we've done here, and I'm looking specifically at the Word document, is we have some instructions on how to use the Word document to make this work for you. And what we've done is we've created this template with some subsections and some sections already in place. Each of the sections has some suggestions or some instructions in blue text. You need to remove that before you publish this document. And I'll show you what I'm talking about as we get along. We do recommend that you write an introductory statement to each section that kind of applies to you. We haven't done that for you because you need to personalize it for yourself. The sections that we've included are guides. They are just guides. So if you want to add to them, if you want to change them, if you want to delete some, that's great. That's up to you. Make it work best for you. You don't need to complete the sections in order. So if you're having your committee and you want to come back to pieces, that's fine. Do it however you want. And then these things on the bottom here are very important before you publish. So replace all content inside the brackets. So we have some brackets, and you'll see this a little bit later. Change those with your personal names. These are just areas that you can replace with your own personal information. And then, as I said, remove the first 2 pages of the document before you publish. Okay, so these instructions are important. It might be good just to have a copy of them somewhere else while you're going through the document, so you remember that you cover all your bases. And then let me talk about copyrights. So I'll give you a quick brief understanding of what a copyright is. A copyright is something that is given by the author on a document or a produced piece of anything, media, audio, video, whatever. And what it does is it expresses their rights on a global stage on, what sort of rights the author has to that content. And if you go online, you'll see, or you go on various things, you'll always see this format for people that know what they're doing. You are stating your copyright from the date of inception, who are the authors, and then what rights they're looking for. So you'll see all rights reserved, some rights reserved, no rights reserved. Those are the 3 options in copyright. We have listed no rights reserved. What this means is we hold no rights to any copyright on this document. If you want to change the way it looks, if you want to rip it apart, if you want to use any of the terminal, any of the text at all in any other way, it's up to you. This is a truly free gift of a document to you that you can do anything you want. You do not even need to attribute it to us, credit it, license, anything. You can do whatever you want with this document. Okay, so that statement is very clear here, and you can do what you like. Okay, so you're going to remove those first 2 pages, and then we're going to get into here. Every good policy will have a clear title page. I won't go through this in much depth. We would recommend that you put some sort of logo or change this document to make sure that it aligns to your policy standards. You all have some template that you're using. Make this align to that. It is important that people know how up to date the document is, though. So having a revision date is very important. Now you're going to notice on the bottom of each page that we have put inside the footer an opportunity for you to put your name and the revision date. So these items within the brackets are things that you should update with your school's information. Please do not publish it with the word revision date on the bottom here as you put it and make it available globally. Okay, now let's actually jump into the content. So we put in a table of contents for you. And this table of contents will cover all the major areas that we're going to talk about today over the next probably 30 to 40 minutes. If we have time, we'll get to another policy. I'm not sure if we will. But being a living document, this will actually auto update for you. So if you go in and you make your roles and responsibilities, which is on page 6, run for 3 pages, you can come back to this table and you can update it. And there's specific instructions on how to update it here, but ostensibly all you do is you right click and you say update field, and then you say update the entire table, okay? Now, let me show you how that works. So this says safeguarding commitment statements, and I'm going to write something like by IRCOS, okay? So notice I've changed this. Now, if I go up here, it hasn't changed. It's this document right here, okay? Or this line right here. If I right click and update the field, you'll notice it now changes, okay? This is also a link, which works on Google. So I can click on this and it'll take me directly here, okay? So I'm gonna remove this. But what that does is it allows you to use this document without having to make any major changes. It's got styles, it's got all these things in place to allow you to keep a very clean, updated table of contents, so that all you're focusing on is putting in the content. Okay, so I'm going to give you one more instruction, and then we're just going to get to content for the rest of this presentation. And that is these blue sections. You notice that they're in a different font. You notice they are this kind of weird color blue, and they've got these little, I don't know what they're called, parrots, carrots, something like that. Remove these. These are just here for you. They are not designed for the final audience. So get rid of them when you're ready, okay? Okay, so let's jump in. what we suggest you have is a bit of an introduction and then some major sections within the child protection policy. And you're going to notice that these sections align pretty closely to our overview of child protection. So we're taking that document we talked about last time and we're putting it into some level of practice where you are not only answering the question of how do we handle that, you're actually putting it into writing as a central resource for people to understand some of those questions, okay? And then within the appendices, which we'll get to at the end, you have the ability to cross-reference or connect to other key policies within your school that people need to refer to get more information about specific policies or procedures or practices or anything, okay? Okay, so let's jump into the first one. Safeguarding and Child Protection Policy Statement. This is that overview statement that outlines the school community's commitment to child protection, safeguarding, and student well-being. So we stay it right here. It should be one that is shared by the community. It might be one you already have. This is an important starting point because it's something that should live on this document and be introduced to people straight away, but also be one that potentially could live in other places. So if it's a short sentence or two, maybe it lives on signage, maybe it's in various documents that are shared within the community. And if you have this commitment statement being something that is consistent amongst various communications, then it becomes more lived. People understand it much more. They can almost recite it. And it just becomes very clear to the community that this is a shared value by everyone because it is a common statement. As you're looking into this, some key areas of consideration as you're constructing it, you might want to look back at our definition of child protection. You might want to look at other resources, but these are three things that we recommend that you look at real clearly in constructing this statement. The importance of child protection. And notice we haven't just said for the school community or for your particular school. Why is child protection important? Almost full stop. Safeguarding as a responsibility for everybody, right? This is something that everybody has a responsibility for. Can you state that in a way that everybody understands? And that student well-being is at the heart of everything that we do. So those sorts of ideas come across very strongly within this commitment statement if you can throw it right there at the beginning. Okay. Yeah. So now let's move on to the next one. We've said before that the culture of child protection is driven by the leadership. It's driven by the school leadership, the head of school, the board, the owners, whoever that is. That it's put into action from an operational standpoint by many other people. It's driven operationally by a designated safeguarding lead, but that culture, that commitment, those actions around child protection that are lived by the community will be driven by the leadership. In order to make child protection a commitment or to make it a priority for the school, it needs to be something that is spoken about by the leadership. And that's why we have included this. So having those key governance, board, head of school leadership folks putting in introductions or statements of commitment right here is critical before you get into any of the details. Because it kind of is telling people, previously, this is our community focus, but this is that statement from our leader that says this is something very important. And you all do it on your websites. You know, every website that I visit these days has a statement from the head of school or the board or a director or somebody. Do the same thing here. And then this makes a very clear understanding culturally by everybody in the community that child protection is really important. Okay. You may want more than one of them. You may want one from the board and one from the head of school. If there's an ownership group that might need some cross-referencing, you know, kind of make this work for you. Some areas to consider as you're looking at this introduction are the importance of child protection from a leadership perspective. So we've already talked about it from the community. Now talk about it from the leadership. The cultural, strategic, and operational nature of child safeguarding or child protection. So not just talking about this is something we're committed to, but we do understand that it is involved in every one of our operations and every decision at the school. And then, you know, having the leadership making a statement about keeping every child safe goes a very, very long way. So something that I would definitely include here. and working together with that leadership to make sure that the statement aligns with the rest of the policy is also very valuable. Anything you want to say there, Chris? Because I know you talk a lot with leaders about them demonstrating their commitment to child protection.
Yeah, I think it's important that they have effective, real and visible buy-in, if you like, to the policy. That's important if you want to create the culture of the organization, because creating a good, safe child safeguarding culture within a school particularly, it has to be top down. It really has to be driven from the top. So getting that sort of buy-in, that visibility at that stage, at this stage, is really, really important.
The next thing we suggest you do, as we all have, is a nice introduction. And this introduction is designed for the audience to understand where the school is coming from. So you're giving an introduction to what's going to come next by giving a background basically on what the scope of the policy is, the background of the school, and then just making some clear definitions that can be shared within the school. So as you'll see down here at the bottom, the black areas are what you're going to fill in. Okay, but we have an introduction at the beginning, or we have an explanation at the beginning of each section to talk about what each of those sections are for. And then on some of them, we have a set of suggestions of things you may want to consider as you're filling out a particular subsection. Okay, so this particular section has 3 subsections: the context of the school, and this is where we talk about key aspects of the school. So we are an IB school serving an inclusive group of kindergarten to grade 8 students in Thailand. Okay, so that's important. What are the important aspects of the surrounding community? What are the important parts of the population that you account for specifically within this population and you recognize? That's important here. We need to talk about that because, again, the child protection policy is designed specifically for your school and won't work for other people. Okay. Number 2, what is the scope of this policy? Okay. So it should reflect the conduct and responsibilities of all adults and students in the school. It should mention, among other items, in school and out of school activities, live interactions, and online conduct. So, as I said, this policy needs to be an overview. And this is almost a protective element for you to make sure that it doesn't become too big. You are not putting your safer recruitment practices inside this document. You are not going through minutia about how to execute on everything. Those are other policies. So you need to make clear here that that other policies will be linked to talk about details of how we put these things into action. So make sure you understand where the limits of this policy are. And then it's always good to start with a set of definitions that are designed and understood by the school community. And so we've put a couple of recommendations here of things you should include, but this is not an exhaustive list. However, these items we would highly recommend that you have definitions for. What is your definition of child protection? What are definitions of various types of abuse that you're asking people to keep an eye out for or to protect children from? Understand about grooming behaviors and describe that here as something that you're watching. Talk about your definitions of risk, danger, and hurt. Have a focus on peer abuse. Self-harm is one that we didn't have in previous versions and kind of talking about this, but this is a major topic around child protection, even from themselves, that needs to be addressed in your child protection policy. So having a self-harm definition here that maybe even is eventually going to be linked to a self-harm policy is something very valuable. Obviously, internet-related dangers and cyberbullying is a big thing. What is a concern? How do you define define a concern at your school? And then report it. What is reporting, and then how is it done, and those sorts of things. So these sorts of definitions, amongst others, really set the stage very nicely for people understanding your approach to child protection and kind of their responsibilities. Chris, can I ask you real briefly on this one? Are there other, we said this is not an exhaustive list. Are there resources that people can visit to find other things that they may want to define, maybe other policies or sites or something?
Yeah, there's plenty of material available. And one of the best sites for international schools will be the ICMEC site, icmec.org, which is the icmec.org. I think we refer to it later in this presentation, so there's a link to it. But in there's lots of resources for this type of issue. And so people can go in and scroll through and see what is more likely to suit their organization.
Sorry, I misspelled it. ICMEC.
EEC,
Yeah,
icmec.org.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I put an extra I in there. Okay. All right. So let's move on and we'll talk about roles and responsibilities. So you notice there's a bit of a bit of a grouping here when we put these pieces together. So we talk about roles and responsibilities of the individuals within the school. Then we talk about the documentation and procedures on a school level. We talk about employees and employees and various people in school and how to train and monitor them. And then we talk about the campus itself. And then we finish off with a monitoring and evaluation piece so that we know that this stays up to date. So the very first thing that we suggest that you focus on is this notion of roles and responsibilities. Okay. The first section that we suggest that you talk about is this idea of duty of care. Now, within this, we suggest that you make a clear statement of the school's commitment to the definition of commitment and definition of duty of care for all adults being responsible for child protection. So again, this is a defining statement that helps set the stage for everybody. You may have a definition of duty of care. There are actually legal definitions around duty of care, but figure out how this works for the context of your school. And this is where you can make it very clear that everybody has a role to play, which is something that we've talked about quite a bit. We then talk about specific elements of your school. So responsibility holders. Who are the responsibility holders related to child protection? And this is where you can define the difference between your strategic head and your operational head. You can talk about the role of the designated safeguarding lead and maybe the role of the head of school or some leadership being responsible for the strategic elements in a formal capacity. So this is where they should be named and described. It is the recommendation from Chris and from a lot of other people that we've talked to that you have a standing child protection committee that meets on a regular basis. This is where you will outline that committee. Talk about how it connects to both the strategic and the operational and what their duties and responsibilities with some sort of guiding statement around membership. Okay, so this is a good piece to have. Then the big piece is that the designated safeguarding lead is the operational head of safeguarding at the school. They ensure that the cameras are working properly, that the reporting functions are done correctly, that incident management is handled correctly. They're also the connection to the strategic group to make sure that the strategy is put into practice. This is your best opportunity to give an identification of that role of that designated safeguarding lead. What do they do at your school? What is the thing that, what is the job description or what are the roles that they would do within your community that make them so specific or so valuable, and how are you going to treat them? We actually have a webinar in December talking about the role of the designated safeguarding lead. So you may want to write this up, and then hopefully some of those materials will help you kind of formulate that a little bit more later on. Okay. Okay. So yeah. So what you do here is you just use those suggestions and explanations in crafting these items to make sure that they can kind of meet. And you'll notice that within the duty of care, or within the roles and responsibilities, you only have a certain set of subsections. So this provides you the opportunity to go in depth in some of these subsections and talk about the needs of your school, but then also covering that requirement of the overview of child protection that we mentioned last time. Okay, then we move next into documentation and confidentiality. And this is where we talk about data and records and access and those sorts of things. So people have roles, there is going to be information, and there's going to be reporting that comes in. How do you handle it? Where do you keep it? And this is an interesting one because you need to give enough depth for people to understand that there are rules and requirements without getting too into the weeds. You do not want to talk about access to child protection data on a really low level around, user types and times and specific devices. No, you don't want that. What you want to be talking about are standards and rules around child protection data that can be applied in various places. So you may have some paper records. You may be using an online system to manage child protection reporting. You may be just using Google Docs. Okay. What are the overarching standards and rules around child protection data, knowing that this is about as personal information as you're going to get next to specific health data? So you need to have that access really clear. This is an accreditation requirement. It's a best practice for your school, and in a number of ways, this is a legal requirement. So have those standards clearly outlined, and have a very clear notion around data protection and confidentiality. State that here. This is where you may want to bring in your data protection officer. You may want to talk very clearly within your group about how you're going to maintain confidentiality. This is a big thing. This is a big one to go through in depth from an operational perspective. A lot of data protection requirements will mention how long and how specifically where and how you keep your records. Take that and go further. Talk about the systems you're going to use, the procedures that will be undertaken to keep records on child protection related items. And this could be training, this could be incident management, this could be personnel items. There's a number of items that will go into these records, but there needs to be an understanding of what's the term, Chris? The single central record, is that what it is? What's
single central record. Yeah.
Okay. So is that what you outline here? Is that single central record and all of the kind of the connecting pieces to other systems?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's perfect. Just there.
Okay. So if you're from a British background, you'll know this notion of the single central record. Outline it here. If you're not from that background, understand your kind of data ecosystem and ecology and outline it here. And then communications are also very important. How are you communicating things internally related to generic child protection items? How are you connecting externally for generic things? But then, how are you dealing with incident communications internally and externally? Who has access? Those sorts of pieces are critical. And there are really 4 items, right? There's the internal and external for the generic, and there's the internal and external for the specific. Having an understanding of how you're going to approach that will save you so much time later on. Because when an incident occurs, there is going to need to be a set of procedures that are followed. The communication one tends to be one that is very difficult for schools. And so if you have a very clear statement that all external communications around any incident go through the designated safeguarding lead or the head of school, great. Then everybody knows we do not talk with anybody outside the school about any of these items, even if it's a legal requirement, they still have to go through the designated safeguarding lead. So set that up and make that really clear for everybody. Okay. All right, let's keep going on. I hope I'm not going too fast. Please ask any questions you have. We do have a lot here. We move on to the reporting items. We've kind of made we kind of made a tangential move, or kind of a transition here from the record keeping of data to how you actually handle the items that are going to generate that data. All right. And when we talk about child protection, and we mentioned this in the overview last time, that reporting and recording and response are critical. Okay. So what we recommend that you do is that you highlight these 3 areas. Make a very clear statement around mandatory reporting. It is mandatory for all adults to report on any child protection concerns they have, whether they visit, work, or volunteer. And as you talk about this mandatory reporting, one of the recommendations that we have is that you talk about it from a positive standpoint rather than a punitive standpoint. So not that you have to report, otherwise you're going to lose access or you're going to go to jail, or something bad will happen. Talk about all adults being part of a team that are responsible for child protection. And one of the mandatory responsibilities of being part of that team is to share what you know by reporting any concerns you have. That is the best way for students to be protected, is if they know is if we know that every adult pair of eyes will be reporting on something and that there won't be blowback, right? And that's why we mentioned this whistleblower statement down here. But making that clear that this is a mandatory element of being in the community, and it's one that is supported by the school and something that's encouraged as a team-based view rather than a job responsibility punitive view, will go really far. Okay, this is a big one. This one actually should be a pretty substantive element of your child protection policy because it talks about reporting and incident management. And this one should be detailed. Discuss how you handle incidents, what the reporting frameworks are, communications, channels, procedures, who is going to be involved, the decision trees, responsibilities, and record keeping. So this one can get a little bit larger. I'm not going to give you a certain number of words, but this is one that you should work very closely with the operations team to make sure that this is something that everybody clearly understands. And what we find is that when you do a revision, even if it's a non-scheduled revision, this is the area where we do a lot of our revisions, right? We need to tighten up the process or the procedures. That typically goes here, okay? And then a whistleblowing statement is also very important because one of the things that people worry about in reporting child protection incidents is that they're making an accusation, that they're putting their own jobs or personal safety in jeopardy, that they may get involved or accuse themselves. So in those sorts of approaches and those sorts of worries, you can lose data. And the way that we keep children safe is if people report their concerns and you investigate them and you take appropriate action. If people are not reporting because they're worried, then you're going to lose critical information. Incidents will go unreported. So having this whistleblowing policy protects those people and makes it clear to everyone that you don't get in trouble for reporting. You don't get in trouble for sharing what you've seen. Okay. Chris, do you want to say anything more about that? Because this is one that is being added more and more to child protection statements.
Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely critical. And it's how you educate and portray this information to staff because of the concerns that staff carry with them around, losing contracts or not being believed or thinking they've got it wrong or dropping somebody in it, etc., etc. The reality is that yes, you may see something and you may not always be right, but it's about doing it for the right reason and not being blamed by the organization for doing something which is an attempt to provide the right type of information or concerns to give heads up on something that may be happening. I mean, this is very similar to some of the stuff that went on with the William Vahey case, where information wasn't passed on. And in my years of investigating child abuse cases, I can tell you if I had a dollar for every time somebody said, "Oh, I thought something was wrong with that individual, but I didn't say anything," then I'd be very wealthy, because this is a major issue. And so it's about creating that culture that makes this type of discussion transparent, open, honest. It's a discussion that's talked about regularly. It's not a taboo subject. It's something that the management walk and talk regularly and support staff in that engagement. And that is critical.
Can we talk about that a little bit more? Because you're bringing up a very important point that I think that people struggle with. And we're going to get more to this next time when we talk about training. But your goal as a school is not to have every adult be a child protection expert, right? I mean, that's what Chris does. I'm not a child protection expert, and I've been working with Chris for a few years now. We're not looking to create child protection experts out of all of these people that know how to deal with specific incidents, know how to handle all of these issues. We're looking for them to be informed reporters. Now, teachers have a different role, leaders have a different role, everybody has a different role related to how they interact with the students. But ostensibly, what you're trying to encapsulate with this document is we have a decision-making framework and we have an incident management framework where we will take data from the community and respond appropriately. So the designated safeguarding lead, some of the leadership, people like Chris coming in to help, those are the ones that make the decisions around how incidents and how child protection specifics should be taken forward. But they can only operate if people feel empowered and understand their role in reporting what they see. So just because somebody reports doesn't necessarily mean that a child abuse incident happened, doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to get in trouble, and it's not for them to decide. What you're trying to get across here is it is safe to report, we want you to report, and we have a framework in place in order to make an informed decision about actions that have to be taken. Is that a good way to put it, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, you want people, when they feel that there is a concern and they have that concern, and sometimes that manifests in just an engagement with another member of staff, something that may have been said, a remark, something that they picked up, something that they've seen or witnessed that they weren't comfortable with. If you feel, this is how we teach kids, isn't it? If you feel uncomfortable, then that's the time we need to do something about it. And that's exactly the same here for adults. If you feel uncomfortable about something, that's the time to say something, not wait, because the piece of information that you have about being uncomfortable may be just another piece of the jigsaw, which you will not know that exists already, and that there are 3 or 4 other pieces of jigsaw that are already been collected about this individual. And actually the piece that you hold may be just reinforcement or actually start to create the picture that we need to understand what's going on. So it is really important to encourage staff to come forward when they have concerns around safeguarding, no matter what that concern is or who it's about.
Well, and Declan just put a nice comment up here, which reinforces this point. What he says is, sometimes reporting can be weaponized against people, which is very important to consider for cultures which take the approach of guilty until proven innocent, unlike the Western approach. Thus, safeguards need to be considered. And that's exactly right. People need to report and understand that somebody else is going to handle the report, right? Somebody else is going to make that determination about how best to move forward with that information without assuming guilt straight away. So we don't want to discourage people from reporting. We want to make sure that they're reporting to a system that can handle it appropriately to protect the person that's reporting and the person that has been reported upon. So those safeguards are critical and need to be outlined in this document. Okay, that's what keeps people safe. Thank you, Rosa. Thank you for agreeing. Okay, let's keep going on. I'm conscious of time. So the next piece that we're moving on to is personnel oversight. And this does relate to that notion of reporting and monitoring. This is an area that becomes a bit contentious for schools and one that becomes the most difficult. And where we run into a lot of difficulties in working with schools specifically is that they forget a few elements here. So first off, there needs to be a lot of clarity around the code of conduct. Not just that we want you to report, but there are certain norms, expectations, behaviors, attitudes that we need you to align to as either a staff member or a student or whomever. But adults need to understand what is the code of conduct and make specific references to those documents where they can see them in depth. Having this in here not only says that we want you to report on things that you're seeing, but recognize that there is a code of conduct for you to be a part of our community. Okay. This is where we run into a lot of issues. This is an area of focus quite heavily for child protection trainings. And I know Chris does a lot of work around safer recruitment. We have expanded this very purposefully because safer recruitment typically talks about the recruitment of teachers or individual staff members. And there's a lot of holes there. Schools will often use a background checking service, which is vitally important, and I'm not suggesting don't do that. But going further in depth in your recruitment is very important. And having a policy or having a set of practices around safer recruitment are critical for people entering into the system, so entering into the community. However, where we run into gaps is this part, is the contracting. So people are safe recruited, they get through whatever the policies and they move forward. Well, those are great, and those are important and ones that I do want you to focus on, but do remember that you have a lot of other adults that have different levels of connection to the school. You have outside vendors, you have parent volunteers, you have people that are not going to go through a safer recruitment process and have different levels of commitment to the school that also need to be considered at entry. So as you're looking at this particular section, think about everybody that is coming into the community, how you're going to get a good feel for them in terms of safety, and what the contracts that you're going to include and the screenings that you're going to include with your vendors will ensure that child protection is included. Okay, so this one take a bit of time to go through some depth. Maybe even talk about your background check procedures and various other things. And then another piece that we run into issues with quite frequently is that people are hired, they've done the screening, they're great, they get into the school, and then they're not monitored any further. These folks, there's a number of reasons to monitor them, and you can probably figure this out for yourself, but child protection monitoring does not end when the contract is signed or the person shows up on campus. You do need to have a set of guidelines and procedures on how to monitor existing personnel, parent volunteers, whomever it is, with regard to child protection. There needs to be some sort of reference to the record keeping and where this information is stored, so that you are able to go back and look at performance and look at various things that have happened related to particular people. Some of the folks at your schools have been hired decades ago, decades and decades and decades ago, right? Do you have a history of monitoring of their training, of any incidents, of any reporting that was made about them? How do you create a history of the people that are actually inside your school and have gotten through all of these external safeguards? Okay, so that's an important piece that we recommend you include in here as well. Okay, next we go into training, which is something you would keep in your monitoring procedures because, and we've said this numerous times, it's the reason that child safeguarding exists, and that is that we do believe that everyone has a role to play in child protection. Everyone does. So what we recommend is that you outline your training requirements, just how you're going to approach them. Don't go into too much depth. Don't go into details around we're going to use this curriculum and we're going to use this timing, but maybe making a statement of everybody will have a role to play and everybody will be trained. Those items we want to cover in here. So first off, a statement and maybe a brief outline of the curriculum as it relates to students. So Christopher had a question here of, can we actually have the students go through the actual program and advisory? What we recommend and what is best practice for you is to include safeguarding in your curriculum for all students in an age appropriate level. Now, a lot of schools will do this in advisory. They'll have programs that they do throughout the year that are geared towards primary school students or older students. They'll make links to other parts of the well-being curriculum or the social emotional learning curriculum. But having something here that states very clearly that all of the students will engage in safeguarding curriculum is important. And yeah, I think you can. I think it is something that is very important for all of them to do. Okay. Whole school safeguarding training, making a statement that everybody needs to be trained in some fashion, from students to visitors, to parents, to employees, to vendors. Everybody will be trained, and to say why. Why is that important that every pair of eyes is trained on child protection? And there's a lot of answers here, but really you want every person to be monitoring the situation, the environment, and the others to make sure that children are safe and for them to be knowledgeable about how to report on what they see. So making that statement here and making a commitment here is very, very vital so that you know that certain members of the community won't slip through. And we find this in a number of schools. And actually, this is why Chris and I have worked together to build childsafeguarding.com, because we saw a bunch of gardeners at a school that were seeing things by being part of the community, but didn't know what they were seeing, didn't know how to report about them, and didn't know where to report. So making those statements here in the policy is quite vital. And then, Declan made a very good point, and I know that Rosa connected it back, is that understanding your local context is critical. Whether it is laws or resources or cultures, having that connection to your local context in terms of training is absolutely vital. So it may be including culturally relevant training, training for host country laws for critical individuals, understanding the resources that are or are not available, having those listed here just makes a better connection between you and the greater context of the community you're in. So we have a question here about prepackaged safeguarding curricula that are available for purchase. Do you have any recommendations or favorites? Yes, we do. Let me hold off on that towards the end, because this is a bit of a self-serving question for me, and I want to be very honest about that. Okay. All right. So let's move on from training. Now let's talk about environmental security. So we've spent a lot of time talking about culture and environment and kind of how we handle the people. But what about the campus? What about making sure the physical campus is something that's safe? And I do apologize, just like last time, we're going to go a little bit over. So apologies for that. And we probably won't be looking at the example policy today, but you'll have a link to it if you want to take a look. Okay, so we've broken down environmental security, which environmental security is the security to make the physical environment at the school safer for children. We've broken it up into 4 areas that we recommend that you cover. So the first one is, how are you approaching campus monitoring? Maybe you have a CCTV system, maybe there's a contracted security, maybe we have people walking around. Are there procedures and policies that we can reference in this section around monitoring? Not necessarily physical systems, but the monitoring of the campus. That's critical, and to make that understood that this is an area of focus for the school itself. Security systems. So what we recommend is an overview of protective measures in the environment that are used to safeguard the students. This is an appropriate place to talk about access to the school. Identification requirements. Does everybody need to wear a badge or an ID? Signage, as well as other security systems, can be outlined here. Requirements for visitors. So the visitors are the group of adults that you have the least interactions with, you have the least opportunity to train and to make clear how to protect the children, and are arguably one of the more vulnerable areas of the school. So having that an understanding of how we treat visitors and their limitations and requirements, including those parents that do not spend a lot of time at school, is something that we recommend you have here. And then finally, how are you doing an overall campus evaluation? What are your commitments to doing security checks and risk assessments around school from experts or outside individuals? That's something that can be listed here. And it just helps people understand that commitment and gives you some mile markers or things to work towards to ensure that the campus is staying safe. And it's something that continues to be an area of focus. Okay. And then we'd like to finish up our policies with a note about revision. And I have another question. I will answer all the questions at the end, if that's okay. Thank you. So monitoring and evaluation talks about how do we ensure that this policy and all of the things that you've put into place are reviewed and revised and evergreen, basically, because this really is a living document. And we break this down into 3 areas that we suggest you focus on. The first is a statement about regular reviews. Will this policy be reviewed on an annual basis and revised on a biannual basis? You know, think about those. It is good practice to review this policy within your committee on an annual basis, but maybe not doing a full set of revisions every year, but looking at minor changes and, and updates as needed. It's also a good idea to list some of those key responsibility holders, especially if the DSL has moved on and you want to put a different name in here. Keep those up to date. Those need to be as up to date as possible. And since it's online, you know, it's not a paper policy, so you're able to update that whenever you need. Talk about risk assessment. So what are the assessment procedures that the school is employing? And this may be an insurance requirement, it may be a legal requirement as well. How do you assess the risk for child protection within the school community? List that out here. And then a big thing that we actually see as a bit of an absence from some schools, and that is if you do have an incident of whatever severity or size, how do you do an inquiry? How do you do a follow-up to those particular incidents? You know, because there's always stuff to be learned around reviewing the process and what actually happened within a particular incident that can be reviewed here. Chris, am I missing anything here? I mean, I feel like I've gone through this a bit quick. Are there elements around this review and monitoring processes that you'd recommend?
Well, the monitoring sort of operates at a couple of different levels as well. So it's operating at the incident level, so that you're monitoring ongoing incidents. And the sort of evaluation end of the product is also looped back to feedback into lessons learnt from a particular incident or from a particular significant crisis, where you are looking at lessons learned that feed back into policy to change or update policy, or looping back into training to actually update some of the training that you give to staff. But essentially, that covers most of the main areas.
Thank you. The last thing that we recommend is that you cross-reference through an appendices section to other relevant policies. And we've mentioned this earlier, that policy ecosystem. This is where you can make some of those connections and talk about which policies are part of that larger group of policies that should be reviewed for specifics around processes or things that are procedures and things that need to be done. Even having connections to local resources and phone numbers for various people that can be contacted, those can all be put here, so that people understand that you're using this as kind of a top level overview of child protection to set the stage and make your commitments, but that there's far more detail and minutia and references and resources available that the school is utilizing. So put that in here, and this is something that can be reviewed on an annual basis as well. Okay, so that's the policy. What I'm going to do now is go back to the PowerPoint. And we have a few questions, and we will address those. I'm not ignoring those, so just know that we'll come back to those real briefly. I just want to get through the last bits of the PowerPoint and then move forward with the questions before we finish up. Okay, so we've given you these templates, and again, they're for you to use. Go right ahead. You can share them with anybody. You can tear them apart. Please use them to build out your own child protection policies. Okay. There's a sample policy here that we ran out of time and we're not going to have a chance to review, but that's okay. If you want to go in here, it's not designed specifically for schools, but it does have a lot of good elements that don't totally match this template, because you may want to go in a little bit a few other directions, and it'll just kind of open up your thinking to different structures for your child protection policies. So let's talk about putting it together real quickly, and then we'll finish off. Okay. Yep, thank you, Aaron. You put a link in there. So, sorry, I just move some windows out of the way here. So a few best practices when you're approaching crafting this child protection policy. Remember your audience. That's a big thing. You are not writing this for a normal policy exercise. A lot of policies are written for specific operational purposes, or an accreditation body, or a specific subgroup. You're not doing that here. This is probably the one policy that everybody's going to read. So make sure that you have it written for a broader audience. Consider translations of some of the key items if you need to, because parts of your community maybe won't be able to engage in some of the English content. That's really important. And again, this should be something that's publicly available. Take a community approach. And we addressed this a few times, and there's a number of ways to do this, but it is critical that everyone has a role to play in terms of child protection, and thus should have input in the development of this policy. Always consider your culture. I mean, we had a couple of comments about this already. Legal requirements are different, not only in every country, but there will be some local requirements and laws and customs that you need to account for within child protection. Child abuse, child rearing, child interactions is very culturally connected. It is the one thing that seems to be universal. And so understanding that is critical as you craft these statements and these policies. If you do it absent from your local culture, you're going to run into some big problems. Use other policies for depth and complexity. Again, don't solve your problems with this policy. Oh, well, we haven't detailed out how much time the data needs to stay in the system. That belongs in another policy. We don't need to detail what access the principal has. That's in another policy. Just say the principal has special access to this data or something to that effect. Don't use this policy for depth. Make sure that you have a clear review and revision cycle. And we've already given you some recommendations on this, but my big recommendation is an annual review, a willingness to change any element of it if something critical comes in, like some new post holder comes in or a change to some critical procedure. Change it on the fly. Get your task force together to agree to that change and then publish the change and announce that it has been changed. And then look at a revision cycle that is termed. So maybe every 2 years, every 3 years, whatever works best for you. And then finally, I say this every time, but I'll say it again. Remember, the best way to eat an elephant is one bite at a time. So this is not something you're going to do on a Monday. It is going to take some time. It is a larger activity. So our recommendation is just go through it as you need to. Use the resources that you have at hand. Ask questions. Chris and I are always available to help you if that's something that you're interested in. And you'll get through it, and it will be something that will live beyond those that actually have written the policy. It's something that can be a long-term impactful document for your school. Okay. Let me talk about child safeguarding real quick. I'm going to do it very briefly. A number of you did take me up on this last time, so I will mention it again. Child safeguarding is one of those training pieces that were asked about in the questions. So there are a number of trainings available for various groups. Ours is designed specifically for support staff and parent volunteers. So that very large hole that you typically have in training, and we're going to go through more of this next time. We have it available, and we have languages covering every single one of your schools. So if this is something you're interested in, please register online. Please send me an email. I'll put details in the email again if you want to try it out. We already had, I think, like 10 different schools try it out after the last webinar. Happy to give you a complimentary seat or even take you through it in detail if it's something that you're interested in. Okay. As a reminder, we have some resources for you. Please check them out. And we're doing more webinars. I'm going to answer the questions, so don't worry about that. Chris and I will stay on for questions. But this is the second of 4 webinars. Please use these links, and they will come in the email afterwards. Please use these links to come to our training webinar in November and our designated safeguarding lead webinar in December. And again, there will be resources that you'll be able to take home from those. And with all of these 4 put together, you should have quite a bit of material that should help you with your child protection program. And then I'm just going to leave this on the screen, remembering that you're going to get all of these items. And yeah, let's answer some questions. Okay, so thank you very much. Okay, so let's ask. Okay, great. So let's go through these one at a time. We've got a few questions here. And Chris, maybe you can help me out with some of these. So Amber asks, I know that this was mentioned in the previous training, but what are some examples of prepackaged safeguarding curricula that are available for purchase? Any recommendations or favorites? Obviously, I have a very big favorite in terms of training for support staff because I built it and we're very connected to it. The reason that we have built this is because there's almost nothing available for support staff in terms of their learning abilities, their languages, their accessibility. So I would really take a look at childsafeguarding.com. In terms of student specific ones, and maybe Chris, you can help me out here. I know that Second Step is one that a number of schools are using. Thank you, everybody who has to leave. Thank you for the wonderful comments. We're just going to stay on and answer questions. So anyway, back to some training materials. Second Step is one that a lot of schools will use. Darkness into Light is one that we've heard of. In terms of training for teachers and for staff, there's actually quite a bit. And I don't really want to talk about favorites, but maybe Chris can talk about that a little bit because he does this sort of training. And there's some trade-offs in doing prepackaged online training with students or with teachers that kind of loses some of the context of talking with somebody. So Chris, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do.
Good.
I mean, this is quite a big topic, really. So I'll just try and keep it brief. First of all, my advice is that as good practice, your organization in terms of curriculum material should have end-to-end curriculum material from kindergarten right the way through to year 12, if that's the size of your organization. And as Matt mentioned earlier, it needs to be age appropriate at every stage. So there should be some form of input for children around this material, which is either related to personal safety, pastoral care, well-being, or even the child protection end of that as well. It needs to be integrated. It needs to be taught well. So people need to be trained. You can't just have anybody given a package and told just deliver this. It needs to be done well. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. So that's the principle, is that it needs to run across the whole organization. The second principle is that whatever materials that you use, which are age appropriate, which I've mentioned already, have to be good material. It's no good just picking up things because you've heard of this, or that looks good, or that's pretty, that's glossy, we'll use that. The secret, and I do have examples that you can look at, but here's the trick with it. The first thing is to make sure that whatever program you're picking up for whichever age group and whatever part of the curriculum, that particular program is accredited in a sense that it's actually been evaluated by academic research and that it has passed that test. So there are so many programs out there. If you're selecting a program which you're running out, but actually there's been no research evidence to suggest that in 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, there's any value to that program, there is probably no point doing it in the first place. So test and assess whether these programs that you're using or planning on using actually have any evaluation assessment at the end of them that links them to good research that suggests that they're of value. And I think that what I would be thinking about is looking at some of the, end-to-end stuff. Early stages, many of you would have heard of the PANTS program. That's very good. Towards the other end of the spectrum, if you looked at the South Australian Child Protection Program, and if you sort of just did an engine search on South Australian Child Protection in education, you'll find this. It's a massive program. It's well researched and it covers a number of groups. And I know that there are numerous international schools using that program now, and it is very good. There are others. And if you go onto that ICMEC site, which we mentioned earlier, icmec.org, and go into the education portal, in the resources section, you'll find lots of other suggestions as well. But the trick is just make sure that whatever you're selecting is accredited and it has been researched. So that's the curriculum stuff. When you start looking at programs for staff,
can I jump on that one a little bit? Yeah. Because we actually have a specific question around that, and then we were told that question that was on here was not related to staff, so we don't need to go too far into staff. But Sarah has asked the question, DSL training or level 3 training you can recommend?
Yeah, I mean, there's there's lots of DSL training and level 3 training available across the globe. So it's a case of what you can get at the moment, because obviously because of the pandemic, a lot of this now has reverted to online training, either as a package that's already provided and presented, and you just sit, watch, and take and engage and take part, or you actually find a trainer that delivers it personally through a Zoom or video link. So there's a couple of options there. If you're lucky enough to be able to get somebody doing it face to face, then that for me would be the priority option if it's possible. But if not, then maybe look at a video link to get a trainer in. there are lots of trainers globally that can do this. I mean, the key thing is to make sure that the trainer that's delivering it is actually able to deliver for the international audience, specifically in the international school host country that you're in, so that you get the benefit of understanding how contextually the content fits into your host country environment.
Perfect. Okay, we've got a few others. I'm going to jump around on these because a couple of them are related. So let's start with this one. Do all visitors need to be briefed on our child protection policy, or only those who have direct contact with students, such as trainers, coaches, etc.? What do you think, Chris?
Okay, well, there's no rules. There's no rule book as such on this. It's all about good practice. And my advice would be that it is good practice to engage all visitors at some level with notification or some basic understanding or awareness of child protection. And that can be done very simply by registration. So when they sign in and they collect their badge, for example, so you can have something on the badge, or you can have a document that they actually sign and read before they enter the school. And all it needs to do is just encapsulate, maybe the top 3 things that you want them to be thinking about when they're on site, and what your rules of engagement are with children when they're walking around the site itself. And it doesn't matter whether they're there specifically to have access to children or not. The fact of the matter is that eyes and ears remain the same, whatever contact with children they have, if they're in an environment where children exist. So my advice would be do it for all visitors, but decide on what is the best. And it might be that if you have long-term visitors, that you might do something even more significant with those types of individuals by even giving them your own access to an online program, or even invite them in, if they're long-term visitors, to some of your own programs.
That's great. Okay, we got about 4 more. You're very popular, Chris, as always. You mentioned something about crafting a child-friendly policy for the students. What would this look like? What's the most important element to include in a child-friendly policy?
Okay, well, child-friendly policies are not new. They're quite common practice. And if you have a look at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which has 54 articles, it's quite a lengthy document produced by the United Nations. It's got a lot of specific adult speak in each of those articles, yet they have negotiated and produced a 1-page child version of that. And if you have a look at it, it's online and you can see it. I think it prints out on both sides of an A4, but nonetheless, it covers all 54 articles. It's done in a really nice way, colorful and simple. It's made simple. So I think the same would apply to whatever policy you're trying to portray within your organization. I would engage kids as the stakeholders in this. They're the ones that are going to be you're expecting to read it or at least have a look at it. Then if you're going to go that far, I mean, this might be sound bites that you need to take from policies, as opposed to printing a whole policy out in a child-friendly way. You might actually come up with some key messages and create them as posters. And that might be something that you do, engaging children to actually help you create the posters, and it becomes part of their work as much as it is part of the messaging that you're trying to get across to them or to the school. So lots of different ways of doing that, but keep it simple and hone it down to the key messages, rather than trying to put everything that's in a policy into a child-friendly speak.
Excellent. How do we channel to the parents about child protection policy? I think what she's asking is, how do we get the parents to understand or guide them to the child protection policy? And can we create a workshop for them? And that's absolutely, I'll answer this one. What we recommend is that you make reference to your child protection policy in all kind of community communications. There's a reference to it at the bottom of the email. make special reference to it within the entry admissions documents so that you're guiding them to it there. And yes, doing an annual workshop around the child protection policy is something that's very valuable for parents, because a lot of them, this is a newer concept to them. We haven't talked about child protection forever in schools, and so giving them that ability to ask questions and to understand why you're doing this will go a very long way. But it's that consistency of communication and not just doing a one-off, blast, hey, we've got a new child protection policy, but making it part of every comm is very important. And then we have a related question, which is this. Are there any programs available for parent education? I have concerns about educating our parents about identifying signs of grooming or trauma. Teen suicide is also a big problem in Korea, and I wonder if there is an approachable way to educate parents on signs of depression or suicide. Any suggestions or advice? I don't really have an answer for this one, Chris. Do you have anything that you can share here?
There's plenty of material on the ICMEC site for parents as well, so you can have a look there. I think this is really about engaging with your community and raising the topics with families through the whole school community, and actually even putting a questionnaire out there. Are there things that would be beneficial or useful to you as parents whilst living in this country to understand more about safeguarding or child protection issues? And because of the cultural nature of some of the stuff that operates in different countries, I think there will be an appetite for understanding at a greater level. And sometimes you can just use the vehicle that already exists within a school, which might be something like a parents' association that already operates actively within the school, using that as the vehicle to get out to parents and using that as the portal to bring parents in. But there are lots of issues with the culture that's relevant, and culture and legislation sort of fit hand in glove, and that's really important that we understand and the school understands the synergy between that. So things like age of consent, age of criminal liability, attitudes of parents towards and cultures towards corporal punishment, or even their legislation in some countries, legislation around alcohol, tobacco. Each country varies, particularly some of the big topics like female genital mutilation, cultural challenges that exist in different countries. So, sometimes it's important to put it out there, see what the temperature is around some of these topics, get parents to tell you what they think it is, or get the parent association to actually establish what some of the challenges may be for parents. And actually, sometimes you might find it's fairly simple. It might be just about parenting skills. And then that gives you an opportunity to get into parents to actually support them with parenting skills and move on to safeguarding issues.
Can I just add on to that? Because I've had these same experiences in schools as well. And I think what you're kind of referring to, Amber, is making sure the right people are actually hearing these messages. And what we find within schools is that the same group of parents shows up every time. So you could produce these materials and you can hold your workshops, but you're going to be talking to people you don't need to be talking to. And what I have found most effective is trying to find ambassadors within the parent community that can help you get messages out beyond that first wave that you're already accessing. And within the Korean context, or even a number of these other contexts, it's almost as if you need a culturally relevant approach that will come from a non-expat and somebody that's more culturally connected. And so finding those advocates and finding those ambassadors for you, I think, is just as important as the content itself. So something I would take a look at. Okay, we got one last question. Is there special vetting to be done of the policymakers and the pastoral care and counseling department to ensure that all stakeholders are confident about reporting to them in case of any suspected trend or case? So I think what's being asked here is, we're putting a designated safeguarding lead and we're putting in some people to make these policies, but but do we need to vet them in some way to ensure they are the appropriate people within the community to be handling these materials and can be trusted by the community? That's kind of what I'm getting from the question. What do you think about that one, Chris?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that each of these individuals should already have been vetted, background checks and screening already done when they were employed by the organization, number one. There should be a program that operates within the school of maintaining that. So these checks are redone every so many years. And invariably for me, it's important that the supervision and support of these people who are the key stakeholder group is maintained by the supervision structure and the management structure and the leadership structure within the organization, so that, you know, we're not only keeping an eye on their performance and how they operate, but we're also in respect specifically of safeguarding concerns, but we're also maintaining a supervisory watch or watching brief on them as to how they're managing their own selves in terms of their personal development and some of the personal issues that may be raised when they're dealing with some what can be very delicate, complex and complicated cases of child abuse. So maintaining that they have got the support that they need professionally, which may involve the school enabling them to have professional supervision or access to professional supervision external from the organization, which is a very useful thing. But I would hope that there shouldn't be any need under the circumstances in a school, so long as all the safer recruitment program is being operated for everybody there, that the key stakeholder group should be people that have already gone through that process. And then it's about performance. So then it's about managing that performance.
Is training also a key element here?
Well, critical. I mean, if school leadership are actually appointing people to become designated safeguarding leads, then, you know, they need to be committing to providing resources, providing time, providing training, providing potentially that professional supervision access. This is not just something that you can drop on somebody who wasn't expecting it. You know, this needs to be negotiated. We need to find the right people. This is about putting a square peg in a square hole. This is not about telling somebody you're doing this if that person is not interested in the subject or isn't someone who is keen on this for a variety of personal reasons or previous professional reasons. They may not want to do it. So it's really important that we make the right call here and getting the right people, and that they're supported by the organization.
It almost sounds like you're saying that the capacity and passion and interest are probably more important than the vetting, because the vetting is done at another point.
Yeah, the vetting, I would hope, is already done by the organization. I mean, if it's not, that's a totally different.
That's a different question.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, those are our questions. Does anybody else have anything else you'd like to ask? Chris and I can stay around for another minute or two. I know we're way over time, but we've had another amazing webinar with so many good questions and a lot of good engagement. I really appreciate that. No? Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Look out in the next day or two for the recording from the webinar and your certificates. And again, go into the slides that I give you for, well, I guess I'll probably put them in the email. I'll give you the link to the next two webinars. Please register, join us again. And thank you. I've really enjoyed this. And thank you, Chris. Really appreciate all your work on this.
You're very welcome. It's good to be here.
All right.
Thanks.
Have a good day, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, or the start of your weekend if you're in Canada. Have a good day.